Hi, my name is Holly Capling, and I am going to be talking about medieval castle defenses for my Genius Hour. So first, I wanted to talk about different layouts of a medieval castle and what those can entail. So the first one that I found was a Motte and Bailey medieval castle. This was from the early medieval period. The Motte was a mound of earth, and the Bailey was an area around flattened area beside the mound. The Motte and Bailey Castle was designed so that enemies would have a hard time climbing up the mound. If that wasn't enough, a ditch could have been surrounded by the Motte. Structures were then built on the Bailey. The second castle layout was the Shell Keep Castle. These castles were an adaptation of the Motte and Bailey Castle. The difference is that the Shell Keep castles were built with a thin ring of stone around the structures on top of the Motte. This ring of stone replaced old sea wooden fencing that was used for the Motte and Bailey Castle. The third one I found was the Norman Stone Castle. Now this technically was the first stone castle, as the previous two were primarily made of wood and were usually burnt down with flaming arrows. One of the disadvantages of the Norman Stone Castle was that it required more manpower and time to build. The Norman Stone Castle also included a castle keep or donjon, which was the main or central rectangular tower that sat on the highest point of the bailey. These castles were usually perched on top of rocky cliffs or edges. So the fourth castle layout that I found was the Gothic castle, and this was designed within the mid-medieval era. These castles evolved from the stone castles as they were cold and damp. However, the Gothic castles had larger, lighter windows, higher rooms, and more decorative castle designs. The last castle layout that I found was the concentric castle, and this castle was the most defensive castle plan used to deter attackers, as it was effectively designed to be a castle within a castle. The layout consisted of two outer walls, or two stone walls. One was the outer wall and one was the inner wall. The inner castle wall was higher than the outer one to have an vantage point of taking out the enemies, and if they ever did break through the first outer wall, the first inner wall was able to take out the enemies that way as well. So next I'm going to go ahead and discuss the medieval castle defenses that I found. So the first one is the outer curtain wall. Briefly discussed this in the concentric castle. So the outer curtain wall was the strong outer wall to bear against attacks of battering rams and missiles. It was the strongest wall of the castle, and the castle walls were protected with this outer wall. The next medieval castle defense that I found was the moats. And the moats were small bodies of water that surrounded the castle, and it made it harder for firing missiles and eliminated the use of battering rams against the castle walls. The moat also made it easier for arrowsmen to target enemies as they were stuck on the other side of the moat. The moat did not allow enemies to dig underneath the castle walls and towers and knock them down. Some moats had human waste and fearsome creatures or spears pointed up to discourage anyone from swimming across. So the next castle defense that I found was turrets and towers. So what turrets and towers were is that they allowed arrowsmen and archers to see enemies coming from afar. So this gave them a vantage point as having high towers. The symmetrical towers gave a broader sight line, and taller towers maximized their view. These towers were round, as square towers were easier to take down by the enemies. The arrowsmen also used the turrets, or sometimes called arrow slits, to fire their arrows at the enemies with effectiveness, without the possibility of being hit, as the arrow slits were super thin. So the next one that I found was the gatehouse, and this was essentially the entrance to the castle that allowed food, knights, townspeople, magicians, things like that into the castle. It was filled with many different gates, doors, drawbridges, arrow slits, and murder holes. So speaking of murder holes, that's the next defense that I'm going to talk about. Murder holes were holes in the gatehouse where people would throw hot substances or heavy missiles or something like that down on the enemy to prevent them from getting into the castle. These substances could include scalding hot water, boiling oil, tar, anything that you can think of. They would have thrown down those murder holes. So the next one is the drawbridge, and the drawbridge was essentially the door that moved up and down to gain entrance into the castle as it connected to the ground across the moat. Sometimes it was secured by a long wooden piece of wood and was unsecured when enemies were nearby, that allowed the drawbridge to move up and down. This denied access into the castle as it no longer connected with the ground across the moat. Other drawbridges had counterweights, so as one weight went up, the other went down, and this determined whether the drawbridge was to go up or down as well. So the next medieval castle defense that I found was the barbican, and this was just like an extension to the gatehouse. It was also filled with gates, doors, murder holes, arrow slits, traps, anything that you can think of. And this created a difficult obstacle as it was a narrow path with sharp twists and turns. So the enemy actually was slowed down through that narrow pathway, and it actually gave the archers a vantage point of picking them off while they were in that narrow pathway. And then I found this interesting picture here, and it also gave me some insight into a couple of tricks that I hadn't found before until now. So one of them was the trou de loup, and these were pits around the outside of the moat. So these pits would be dug, and arrows and spears would be pointed upwards and would be covered with leaves or something like that to create a booby trap, so that when enemies were nearby, they would fall through these traps. The other one is the talus, and this was near the outer walls of the castle. So the talus was a sloped base at the bottom of the castle wall, and this defense kept invaders and enemies far from the castle wall if they ever did get across the moat. And the last trick that I found was the spiral staircase. So within the castle towers, there were spiral staircases, but they were clockwise going up. And this was a disadvantage for attackers who were right-handed, because that would have been on the inner part of the spiral staircase. And this would have put them at a disadvantage, as they wouldn't have been able to peer around the corner or defend themselves as quickly as possible. And that's my Genius Hour. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a little bit something new. Thank you.